Oh, cool. All right, so I'm going to talk about Sarah Ann's perspectives. Tentatively, right now, her title is "The Female Rune, Women, Gender, and Conversion." In Viking Age Scandinavia. Just a really, really quick overview of the Viking Age, as Sarah Ann's quick to point out. Most of Scandinavian history is often overlooked, and what is looked at is the Vikings and the battles and how to train your dragon. That's really how most of us are able to relate to this kind of stuff. And she wants to offer a separate view that has been coming into historiography in very recent years. In fact, like her oldest source for women's studies in Viking history is 1987. So a very, very new field of research. The main question she wants to ponder in her research and her thesis is a question of the female-sponsored rune stones in Uppland. Female rune stones at the time are Christian rune stones, just to be specific. And the odd thing about this is that Uppland is a noted pagan center. It was one of the most resistant centers in Scandinavia to the coming age of Christianity in the region. So it's odd that the greatest concentrations of Christian runestones are in Uppland, and she wants to look at why most of these are most of the female-sponsored runestones are also in Uppland. As far as the current state of the field is concerned in her historiography, she points to several prominent historians. First of all, Peter Sawyer, who originally had kind of put Scandinavia along in with Europe as just an extension of European culture and society, and she's quick to point out that most historians nowadays wouldn't really agree with that viewpoint, and that is very important for her thesis, in that saying that Scandinavia's culture and history is wholly separate from Europe is important, so that she can separate gender roles from European gender roles in order to make an argument later on that I'll talk about as far as women's place in pagan society. Next, there's two major scholars of women's history within the field, Jenny Jochen and Carol Clover. First of all, Jenny Jochen's school, she argued that the idea of a strong pagan woman was a myth, and that it was only through Christianity that women were given power. They did this through marriage and the rights that came with marriage and consent of marriage, something that she argues wasn't around in pagan society. But Sarah Ann and other historians that I'll get to have argue that this ignores the potential merits behind paganism, and it's not really as credible as of a view. Next we have Carol Clover, who is kind of if Jenny Jochen's like one main school, she's the other main school of thought. She proposes a one-sex model of Viking society, meaning that there wasn't like a male-female role. It was everyone was the same, and you were judged based on your ability, not your gender. This is the main argument for which Sarah Ann plans to base her thesis on, kind of working off of this assumption. Also, we have Sian Gronle. She has the idea of the female domestic sphere in pagan society equals like the center of society in paganism, whereas once Christianity came in, females were moved to the periphery of society, and it was very patrilineal male-centered organization. And finally, we get back to another Sawyer, the original man when we talked about Peter Sawyer. His wife, archaeologist Bridget Sawyer, has begun tracing runestones and the path of influence of Christianity as it came into Scandinavia, which will also be ultimately extremely important for Sarah Ann's own research. as far as her sources are concerned, she wants to look at a wide range of topics within her sources. She wants to look at history, archaeology, literature, linguistics, and law. Reason for this is that most historians have looked at these, but on an individual basis, and she wants to create a more encompassing interdisciplinary view. Again, founded off of Clover's original model. Her sources, one of the problems that is posed by studying Viking society is that they didn't have written text at the time until the runestones are really the first major works or literature written by the Vikings themselves. So current oral stories that have been written down over the years were actually written after the period of Christianization, so it's hard to diffuse what was Viking culture from what is something that the monks put in when writing these things down. So it poses a problem, but luckily runestones are a excellent primary source, and Sarah Ann plans to use those a lot. Let's see. As far as how she plans to use those, she's actually studying abroad all next year in Uppsala for the 2013-2014, where she'll have a chance to look at and study primary sources of runestones and on-site locations, stuff like that, which will be incredibly helpful. And she's kind of lucky in that she has a year on most of us to get this done. So she plans to have her first, pretty much 2/3 of her thesis written by the time she hits senior year summer, so before senior year. As far as the outline of her argument goes, she would like to spend 4 chapters. Okay, cool. 4 chapters, an introduction, and then a historiographic look at how her argument fits into the field. Then she would like to go and discuss. Present all of her research in Chapter 3, including the archaeological evidence and the fieldwork that she's done in Uppsala. And then finally, in the last chapter, she'll pull it all together and present her conclusion of her findings and what it all means as far as the field of research is concerned. So that's Sarah.
Yeah, okay, wow, that was an amazing overview. That was it in a nutshell. Yeah, no, I'm really, if you can't tell, I love runestones. They're, I think, the greatest thing in the world. I'm really excited to begin work on this thesis, especially working with the runestones. There's been a lot of archaeological work on the runestones and putting forth all these regional patterns that are throughout Scandinavia. But there's not been a lot of work done on contextualizing it within Scandinavian history. So that's one thing I'm really looking forward to accomplishing is, connecting these regional patterns, what the runestones can tell us about Viking Age society and particularly women, and just kind of add it to historical scholarship. So, yeah, and another thing is, there's a ton of, these regional patterns, but since I will be studying in Uppsala, one thing I really want to do is really focus on eastern Sweden, which is this region called Uppland, and just really look at why this pagan center has all these Christian runestones. So, yeah, that's a little bit about what I'm doing. Yeah.
I have 2 questions.
Sure.
First of all, just a logistical question. Are you taking a 5th year?
No.
You were just saying you have a year on us.
So, yeah, I'm technically a 2nd year right now, but I have, senior status, so... I mean...
That's awesome. Have you just been, taking a lot of class since...
Yeah, I came in with a lot of EP credits, so...
Oh, cool. So you have 3 years after... 2 years after this year.
I had... Yeah.
Okay.
She's a sophomore.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's cool.
I got you backstage.
Congratulations. Okay, now my relevant question.
Yeah.
So Nick said that you're working out this one-sex model in which sort of gender and sex differentiation wasn't as big a thing, and it was based on ability.
Yeah.
But I know sometimes in, at least like American culture, in terms of studying like gender and sex and these kind of things, part of the thing is that ability or cultural values are based almost on male values. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, was ability itself gendered, or was it really like? Do you know what I'm asking? Like, was it based on things like
sort of
physical strength, or like?
Yeah.
What does ability
Right.
mean, and was
Sure.
it skewed by gender, even though it was a sex model?
I think that, yeah, so according to her one-sex model, ability means that you were able to defend yourself. It meant that you usually carried a weapon. And so, yeah, it would be how we would perceive maleness today, but I think that that is a modern projection of what it means to be masculine. And my argument and Clover's argument is that wasn't the case back then, that most men in Scandinavia fit into this able category, most women fit into this unable. But there are definitely strong women who definitely fit into how we would see a masculine role today. And there are certainly men who fell under, the unable category. So it wasn't like, completely divided between gender.
Interesting. So it was somewhat gendered, but it wasn't defined by gender.
Right.
Cool.
So, yeah.
Question of clarification. So there is a concentration of female-sponsored Christian runestones in what was a heavily pagan area.
Yes.
So what does that, as of right now, what does that seem to suggest to you?
Yeah, so one thing I think Nick pointed out to me in one of our meetings, I'm kind of hesitant to put forth an argument right now because I don't want to go the route that other scholars have gone with a bias. A lot of scholars have gone and looked at this work with, in their minds, promoting Christianity, and I don't want to, come in with this, bias of and look at the evidence to support my own argument. But right now, I think that it's a combination of a lot of things. I think it's a combination of the gender system, which allowed women to have, economic power. I think that in Sweden, the political situation was such that we didn't have these, powerful Scandinavian kings who said, convert to Christianity or, die. And we also, in Sweden, didn't have this political system that we had in Iceland, where Christianity was developed as, this political consensus. Christianity comes a lot later in Sweden, and I think it was just because of the pagan belief system also, was one more God. So they're easily able to incorporate this Christian God into their, polytheistic religion. You get a lot of missionaries that are coming into Sweden during this time, and I think they were less tolerant than we see elsewhere in Scandinavia. And so I think that promoted, people who were Christian really wanted to have something to really promote their Christianity, and if that makes any sense. So, yeah, that's my hypothesis.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Now,
all right.
give you the podium.
Yeah. Okay, hopefully I'll do his thesis justice. Okay, so Nick's thesis is tentatively titled right now, Re-examining the Closing of Japan, the Dutch Role in Perpetuating Sakoku?
Yeah.
Okay. So the Okugawa/Edo period in Japanese history, which I understand it is medieval, how we would see medieval Japan, has been largely understood as this era which is very closed from the world, and this policy is known as Sakoku. And so this view has come under scrutiny by recent historians who argue that despite the expulsion of Catholic nations, Japan actually did in fact maintain foreign trade and diplomatic relations throughout the reign of the Japanese government, which is the Tokugawa Bakufu. Nevertheless, one challenge Nick faces is that he does have to reconcile with the fact that the Japanese government did expel all European powers with the exception of the Dutch during this time. And they also prohibited any Japanese citizen from traveling abroad. So his argument is that without the Dutch, the Sakoku period, or their policy that the government established would not have been possible, which I think is a really interesting thesis. So the evidence that he has for this is that the Dutch consciously took advantage of Japanese fears of Catholicism as well as European imperialism. So they use this opportunity to consolidate, the Dutch use this opportunity to consolidate and maintain their monopoly on Japanese trade. So some of the central questions for this thesis is how the Dutch came to be the only remaining European power in Japan in 1639, especially despite their armed conflict with the Japanese only a couple years before in Taiwan. Also, why were the Japanese reluctant to trade with any other non-Catholic nation during this period? Who or what provoked the end of this Sakoku policy? So by asking these questions, Nick hopes to discover why the Dutch were much more involved in Japanese foreign policy than previously thought or allowed by scholars. And he wants to question this interpretation of the Sakoku policy as a backwards foreign policy that retarded the growth and modernization of Japan. So to say a little bit about the historiography, the Tokugawa is a military government that controlled Japan during this time for over 200 years. And they had absolute authority and a rigid system of economic and social control that was based on Neo-Confucian principles. So this period has attracted attention from scholars for its infamous Sakoku policy that expelled Christian nations and banned Japanese citizens from traveling abroad. So the history of the scholarship being conducted to challenge this interpretation of Japan as this closed country dates back about 30 years. And it kind of starts with the scholar Robert Sakai, who in his work from 1964, as well as other scholars in the 60s, promoted the existence of trade relations and foreign learning in Japan as evidence that Japan was in fact not this closed nation. So this scholarship, with the focus of exposing Japan's foreign openness, exposes a lack of discourse on how the West perceived the Japan as closed. So this influential scholar, Ronald Tobey, suggested that the government's foreign policy was carefully designed to legitimize their rule as a single authority after years of civil war. And his powerful and influential 1984 study titled State and Diplomacy in Early Modern Japan outlined foreign policy as this consolidation and legitimization of power, and also as the creation of a new world order with Japan at the center. So basically what this means is that the government sought to separate itself from China, and it wanted to secure this position as a legitimate government of a unified Japan. So the scholar Sakai, he demonstrated the importance of trade to the Japanese government, who was in a precarious position because of this Chinese Ming ban on trade with Japan. So as Nick kind of demonstrates in his historiography section, to solve this dilemma of this Chinese ban on trade, the Japanese government used their newly acquired kingdom of, okay, you're going to have to help me with this one.
Ryukyu.
Okay, thank you. To act as this intermediary and facilitate indirect trade with China. So this example shows that Japan was not only, open to foreign trade, but its military conquest of this region shows that it was actually interested in imperialist expansion as well. So yes, several other historians have also focused on trade to show that that Japan was actively involved in foreign relations. So I'll skip through some of the historiography for time's sake. But basically, Nick wants to show that this is like actually complex and well-planned foreign policy that aimed to both legitimize the authority of the Bakufu, as well as to facilitate trade with other consenting nations, which include China, Korea, and of course Holland. So in addition to the economic policy, using economic policy to question the notion of this perception of Japan as closed, intellectual history has also recently contributed to this argument. So scholar Grant Goodman's studies show that Japan's intense interest in the technology and scholarly literature of the West kind of demonstrates that Japan is also not completely closed. They're really interested in Western learning, especially to promote medicine and science, to improve their government and agriculture. So in fact, Japan isn't really attempting to stop the flow of Western learning in Japan. So, get to your argument. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, basically, Nick just wants to show that, one of the reasons that historians up to recently have perceived Japan as being closed is because, in fact, the Dutch are trying to promote this vision of Japan as such. And they do this to promote their own, relationship with Japan. They want to be the only power, as I understand it, involved in Japan. So they really, promote Japanese fears of Christianity, in order to, I don't know, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, to promote this interpretation of Japan. So I guess that's in a nutshell. So yeah, I'll let Nick discuss his thesis outline if he wants to do so, but yeah. Thanks.
Cool. So yeah, that was a really good job. It's not easy to talk about Asian history when you haven't ever been exposed to it, really. So I guess, as Sarah Ann said, that it's been shown in recent years by scholars that this idea of Japan as a closed country isn't really what the West always perceived it to be, and I'm going to be working off of that, and not necessarily refuting that claim, but making sure it's known that Japan was closed, like unquestionably so, to other nations by its own choice. So that we can't just say that it wasn't closed because it traded with all of 3 nations in the whole world. It doesn't really that doesn't really add up. So based from there, I'm going to go and really focus on why they would have ever chosen to take this foreign policy route, and kind of going away from what has been talked about in the recent scholarly work, like Sarah Ann pointed out, about how they chose it to consolidate power and to become the center of the world, to basically separate themselves from China. I'm going to argue that it was actually more so because they could, because of the Dutch, and that if it weren't for the Dutch being there, or being the cutthroat businessmen that they were, the history would have looked a lot different. Any questions?
One of the things that I hear is, or I'll ask you, is where you're going to suggest that this sometimes happens in the historiography, that this sort of dichotomy or this scheme of open-closed is not the most useful frame for thinking about this period. Am I?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. There's been a couple more recent historians than the 30 years ago who have started to realize that as well, and that's kind of what gave me the inspiration for this one. But yeah, it was such a drastic change in from like the late 60s to the late 80s of this is how Japanese history has been taught, that it was closed, and that's a Western conception that's been forced upon the Japanese people, so we have to do everything we can to reverse that. But when in reality you know, it kind of just went a little bit too far in saying that there wasn't a closed country, because there really is.
Is the idea of the Japan being a closed nation like ubiquitous Western thing, or is it specifically American? Because like, I mean, I know the like American Great White Fleet, we opened Japan, but like was that do other countries apply the closed label too? Like, is this the same in like British or French, German?
Yeah, actually, the closed label came because of what happened in the 1600s instead of the opening of Japan. The term actually started being used in the 1800s, though. So that's kind of one of the most disputed aspects of the idea of Sakoku. But really what happened was they said they didn't want Christianity within their country. So although the Spanish and the Portuguese had been able to trade there for the past 20 to 30 years, they kicked out, you know, all of the Spaniards and the Portuguese. So that's really where the concept started. So it's actually more originally of a European idea of how Japan did trade. Yeah.
I guess kind of like what Sam said, do you see, is it different, like the scholarship coming out of Japan on it? Like, did they do that idea of culture?
Not really. It's pretty unified. I guess one thing to point out about my thesis is that Japanese scholarly language is like a whole separate concept in learning Japanese. So I can read it. It takes like 15 minutes to get through one sentence, though. Yeah, it's pretty tough. But I have been able to read a couple, and the scholarship is pretty much on par with what English writing scholars are, and most of the works, the secondary works that I've been reading, are actually Japanese scholars that have been translated by. Yeah.
Thanks very much.